You are listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcon. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Barbara Sutton, Associate Professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University at Albany in New York. She also has affiliations with the Departments of Sociology and with Latin American, Caribbean, and U.S. Latino Studies. She earned a law degree from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, her country of origin, as well as a doctorate in sociology from the University of Oregon. Professor Sutton's scholarly interests include body politics, global gender issues, state violence and human rights, collective memory, and women's movements, particularly in Latin American contexts. Her first book, Bodies in Crisis, Culture, Violence, and Women's Resistance in Neoliberal Argentina, published in 2010 by Rutgers University Press, received the 2011 Gloria E. Anzaldúa Book Prize by the National Women's Studies Association. She has a new book out now called Surviving State Terror, Women's Testimonies of Repression and Resistance in Argentina, published by New York University Press in the spring of 2018. I've invited her on the show to talk about this new book. Welcome, Barbara, to Voces Críticas.
Hi, Silvana. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I wanted to start talking about the transition between your first and your second book. What curiosities lingered for you that now led to this new book on women's testimonios of state violence and terror?
In Bodies in Crisis, I examine violence, for example, economic violence, gender violence, and state violence. And I analyze this through the lens of women's bodily experiences. Part of the background that framed that book was not only an economic crisis that happened in Argentina during the 2000s after years of neoliberal economic policies, but also a longer history, the history of the military dictatorship in Argentina that happened during the 70s and early 80s. This dictatorship really left very deep wounds that the country is still coming to terms with. And that aspect was also part of the analysis. In Bodies in Crisis, I had interviewed a woman who happened to be a survivor of clandestine detention in the 70s during the period that led up to the military coup. And also during that time, there was a case that received media attention. It was a double feminicide in which among the accused were men, a man specifically, for example, who had been involved in human rights violations during the military dictatorship as a member of the security forces. And this got me thinking about the persistence of certain forms of violence and also the ways in which the language and the tactics of violence travel and sometimes at the hands of the same people. This project gave me the opportunity to continue and deepen that line of research to try and understand women's experiences of state repression and what these experiences might tell us about these lingering violent discourses and practices. For me, also, this was not just a political and academic project, but also it was personal, thinking about how society condone or ignore mass atrocities to hearing the testimonies of those directly affected. So it was kind of concentric circles, like going from the outer edges to the inner part.
How did you come to identify the women's testimonies as the method in which to gain a better understanding about gender-based violence and state terror?
Yes, so I knew about the oral archive of Memoria Abierta, the organization that has these testimonies. Yet I did not know, for sure what the testimonies contain and whether I would be able to say something new or make a contribution based on that information. I also felt that if women had given those testimonies was because they wanted to be heard. And I thought that if I could work with them, I should, go ahead and try to do it instead of trying to secure my own interviews and ask women to tell yet again a traumatic history. You have to keep in mind that many of these women had testified multiple times. So perhaps this act of giving testimony is empowering, perhaps traumatizing, but in any case, I felt I should at least, give it a try and see what I could learn from this oral archive in Memoria Abierta. Memoria Abierta, by the way, means open memory.
For many who know a little bit about the history of Argentina's dictatorship in relationship to women activists, many would often think about the Plaza de Mayo, the madres and the abuelas. And this speaks, I think, to the symbolic power of las madres. Your work, however, recognizes that symbolic power, but it also asks us to understand women's agency, resistance, and survival within and beyond this identity of motherhood. Why is this important?
So I think this is important because women as a group embody a variety of experiences and identities, and not just those that happen to coincide with normative gender expectations, for example, being a mother. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo are extremely important. The Plaza de Mayo is a plaza in front of the government building, and this is where these women whose children had disappeared, this is where they gathered to demand information, to demand their return alive. They challenged a powerful and murderous, military structure that had taken over the country's institutions. They confronted the most powerful men in the country who were overseeing, perpetrating these mass atrocities. They have left a powerful legacy, particularly for women. Yet, by focusing only on women as mothers, we also means a more complex understanding both of women and of activism. Something that also I found interesting as I was listening to the testimonies is that some of the women who ended up in clandestine detention centers were themselves mothers of people disappeared, but this experience of themselves as survivors has been cured. Also, by focusing on women not just as mothers, can reveal other experiences. I had also been thinking how in Spanish the word disappeared is gendered with a generic masculine, desaparecido. So it is easy, even discursively, to leave out of the picture women who themselves were disappeared. And among these women, there were those who had histories of activism, who had also important things to say, not only about gender violence in these clandestine detention centers, but also about politics, about activist strategies, and about social change more generally. Another thing that struck me was how even when representing and talking about women taken to detention centers, it was the figure of the pregnant woman that more immediately came into focus. So, for example, sometimes in the streets of Argentina, the disappeared are represented with a silhouette, and for women, the silhouette of the pregnant woman in captivity is particularly salient. At the same time, I think it's important to remember that these women were not just traumatized, raped, or wounded bodies. Yes, they have experienced horror, but they also have other things to say, drawing on their experiences before, during, and after the dictatorship. And I advocate for hearing these women's voices as political voices.
You access these testimonies from the Memoria Abierta's oral archive, and you have access to hundreds of testimonies in this archive, and your book focuses on 52 of them. Could you explain how you came to select the 52 testimonies that you chose for analysis for your book?
At the time I started my research, Memoria Abierta's archive had over 700 testimonies. However, not all of them were testimonies by survivors, and not all of them were testimonies by women. So Memoria Abierta has testimonies by many different groups of people who had been affected in different ways. They had testimonies of relatives of the disappeared, of public officials, of artists, of intellectuals, professionals, also testimonies of activists, religious groups, labor unions, people who ended up going to exile, and then also people who were in clandestine detention centers and who had been political prisoners. I'm making this distinction because some people were in kind of the regular jails, they were recognized, and then there were people who were in the secret sites, and some people who went through both sides. When I got testimonies by women, I was then looking at things like the conditions of use of the interviews, the diversity of the detention centers. Also, that was during the period I was focusing on from 76 to 83, which is the time of the dictatorship. And then also that there were testimonies given by women who had either been teenagers or adults.
You are listening to Dr. Barbara Sutton, Associate Professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University at Albany in New York. She's the author of an award-winning book called Bodies in Crisis, Culture, Violence, and Women's Resistance in Neoliberal Argentina, published in 2010 by Rutgers University Press. She's talking about her latest book, which is called Surviving State Terror, Women's Testimonies of Repression and Resistance in Argentina, published in the spring of 2018 by New York University Press. Now, Barbara, you often use in your work the framing of embodied voices. What do you mean by embodied voices?
I mean several things by this. At a more general level, I'm interested in thinking about body and voice in an integrated manner. We may identify voice, for example, with our ability to express what we think, who we are, what we feel, what we desire. Yet voice also happens in and through a body. And this also has to do with how we conceptualize the self. We may sometimes experience our bodies with a sense of detachment or ownership, like, for example, when we say, I have a body. So it's a self that has a body as if they were separate. But we are also bodies, and at the same time, we're more than bodies. In relation to the topic of my book, I build on scholarship and testimonies that talk about how torture is an attempt to reduce people to their bodies and to deprive them of their own voice. I argue that, so survivors of state terror speak from bodies that have suffered, but their testimonies through which they denounce what happened and tell their truth are also an assertion of voice, are an integration of a body marked by horror and that had to be healed and reconstituted, and the existence of a voice that endured. And then also thinking about the act of testifying, of voicing a truth as also embodied. For example, embodied in the sense of requiring energy, time, being there, like this embodied presence, and experiences emotions that testifying entails. These are embodied emotions, whether it's crying or, all the feelings. It is embodied in a gender way, as well as marked by class or ethnicity, body appearance, which affects also how the testimonies are going to be received, how they're going to be listened to, how they're going to be interpreted. And, we have to think about which bodies are granted more authority. And of course, there are things that are more intangible, right? Like, a trigger is something that may not be obvious from outside, but still is experienced in the body. And also, something that was interesting to me was how, these embodied memories were also sources of deep insight about the human condition, about surviving, about resisting. So there's all these really amazing accounts about, big and small things that happened in clandestine detention centers that you have access to them also by this focus on embodied experience.
I know as part of this research, you had to watch hours and hours of testimonies on a screen. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you managed your feelings in the research process. I know in your book you write about running into a woman whose testimony you had viewed. And so I wondered how surreal that moment must have been to know these important, painful, and traumatic details of this woman's life who now is in front of you, where the past very much exists in the present. And I wondered if you could talk about how feelings, your own feelings, entered the research process.
When I started the project, I was not naive. Like, I knew the history of my country. I knew, that the testimonies would likely be hard to listen. I anticipated narratives of torture or sexual violence or other, atrocious events. But at the same time, I think I was not fully prepared for the emotional toll that this kind of research can take. I was feeling I was getting to know these women. I was sometimes crying, and sometimes I was laughing too. It may seem strange, but, some of them remember funny anecdotes or even managed to laugh. And some of the things I heard, I later blogged and was amazed how later when I was reviewing my notes, I was again confronted with what I had actually listened. And I forgot. And, perhaps because it was just too painful, I remember one of the things that I had blogged that then I came back to pertain a scene in which a child was involved, a child that was about the same age of my child at the time. And then I forgot that I had listened to that. And the only evidence that I had listened to that was I had my notes. So this also, to me, raised questions that, you know, here I was, someone who I actually wanted to listen to these women. I was doing this research, and yet I was blocking some of the information. And then what can it be expected of people who are not interested or who are in denial or who have a radically different political view? In this context, the support of people from Memoria Abierta, the staff members from Memoria Abierta, were really important for me. Sometimes one of them would come and check, you know, how I was doing. And I had conversations, and, you know, I befriended members of the organization later on. And this was also very important for me. It was not just helpful to process or to interpret like the information I was doing research on, but also to process my own feelings. So I think that this is not just an individual process. I think that it's important to think about in a collective way and a sort of collaboration. This is not just me, you know, doing this work, but there's people who gave their testimonies. There's members of a human rights organization that collected them. They made these testimonies available, which is a lot of work, you know, to keep the archive, to collect the testimonies, to organize so that people can look at that. But then also this like human aspect that I felt cared for by people of the organization. They knew that I was listening to this very difficult account.
Thank you so much. Could you share any final thoughts you might have?
Yes, my final thoughts would have to address in some way the current political moment. Just more generally, one of the objectives of my book was not only to understand the traumatic histories of state terror narrated by these women, but also their political voices. In that sense, I was interested about the ideas about democracy, about human rights, about social change, and they raised important questions about, for example, how is a torturer made, or, you know, what structures, what discourses, what situations allow a society to go down a path that upholds a repressive structure or that upholds authoritarianism. And we have seen a revival of authoritarianism in the Americas, in other parts of the world. And I think that in this sense, it is very important to heed voices of these women and other critical voices as well. And finally, I want to point out that in Argentina, this women's movement and the feminist movement has grown and developed in democracy. But this history of this military dictatorship that we were talking about is also, this memory is part of the memories of the movement. In democracy, we see that many forms of violence persist, many forms of injustices persist. We're reminded that these are deaths of democracy, that if we're going to think about, you know, human rights, we need to keep in mind also women's human rights.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for coming on to Voces Críticas today.
Thank you, Silvana.